why, effectively from the advent of Christianity, it was only really a matter of time before the deeply ingrained cultural practice of slavery was going to come to an end. But about powers and principalities, and that fight begins within them first of all. Then they will go looking for other kinds of warfare that are not good. Language is world building. It really is. It starts to actually give you the tools that you need, and you like a boxer who walks into a ring, you're ready for combat. The promise was an illusion, and it's collapsed, and so they're looking, I think, for something tangible, something that's worth fighting for, worth dying for.
My guest today is Brendan Malone, the founder and director of LifeNet New Zealand, a ministry dedicated to leadership, virtue and ethical concern through the promotion of Christian goodness, truth and beauty. He's been working full-time in pro-life marriage and family ministry for over 21 years, and he speaks at churches, universities, high schools and conferences all around New Zealand and Australia. He co-founded the Activate Pro-Life Training Week and Youth Camp, which has been running every year in New Zealand for the past 15 years. Brendan hosts The Dispatches, a podcast and Substack on faith and cultural issues, and he's married, father of 5, his most important vocation. We had a really interesting discussion about what's happening in the wider culture, both within New Zealand and the wider Western Hemisphere, where he sees real challenges and where he sees real seeds of hope for the future. Brendan Malone, welcome to Floreology.
Simon, great to be with you.
Brendan, you've been in ministry now for over 2 decades, working on a range of issues. How did you come into this line of work?
That's a very good question. People often ask me, did I have a plan? Or did I have a sense I wanted to do this kind of work? I would say not really specifically. I would say it really is God opened the doors and I walked through, and I was prudent enough to be discerning and listening to his voice when the doors open and walking through them, and then only really looking back in hindsight, seeing fully just how much he was involved in that. But prior to this ministry work, I always had a strong burning sense of a desire to be an evangelist, to engage with the world around me. But in this specific way and the shape that it's taken, it's really been a journey, and I'm in my 22nd year now. And there have been challenges along the way, and there have been unexpected bumps in the road, and it's all sort of finally started to take a bit more shape. But it wasn't something that initially I had planned, and it's only really looking back, just seeing how much of my life really was in God's hands the whole time and leading to that, even if I didn't recognize it.
Has it changed a lot in terms of the form it's taken over the years or the areas of concentration?
I think so. Well, there's certain things that have remained consistent. The changes really for me have been, when I started this ministry work, I was working for a different organization. I now have my own ministry that I run called LifeNet. It didn't start there. And so there's been a couple of times where I've changed the employment situation, if you like, the actual organization I was working for doing this ministry. And that's been sort of the biggest. There's been a consistent through line, though, and I would say it's been a deepening. So a big focus for my work has really been in the space of bioethics, and particularly issues like abortion and euthanasia, the intersection of morality and human dignity and how human persons should be treated. And so there's been a through line like that. But then what's happened is there's been a deepening of things. And I think for me personally, really, as I've studied and grown and read more widely over, more than 2 decades now, you start to realize how fundamental something like anthropology is, our vision of what it is to be a human person, and how essential that Christian anthropology is. So I talk a lot more about, and I ground a lot more of what I'm doing now and presenting and working in the space in that authentic Christian anthropology, and making sure people understand that. Whereas I wasn't doing that as much at all, or barely at all, when I really first started. I was addressing perhaps the issues that arise from a flawed anthropology without addressing the anthropological issues. So, you could say that it's deepened in that way, really, but the through line has remained consistent.
Your ministry is New Zealand based, New Zealand focused. Do you think the the background culture, has it shifted a lot in the time that you've been active?
Oh, look, I mean, I think that's an absolute given. And for me, like, for example, think about the issue of abortion. And I often say this to groups I'm speaking to now. When I first started speaking on this issue, the general sense within New Zealand culture was that people they really had adopted the safe, legal, and rare mantra of the 1990s that came out. Really, this was very much a Clinton administration, Clinton era type slogan. And it spread out throughout the West. And New Zealand was very much in that mindset. And people generally that you talk to about it, a lot of people actually had their own personal reservations, but they would say, well, it's not really something I'd want to avoid it, I don't like it, but, and then they'd give you a reason for the but, right, afterwards. That has radically shifted now to the point where we've gone from this whole idea of something like that being safe, legal, and rare to the idea that it should be not rare, that it should be, in fact, celebrated, and that very extreme variations of the law and acceptance of that are very normalized now. And there used to be, I think, a sense, at least when I started this work, that there were competing interests here. And particularly the interests of the unborn child at some point had to count for something. But now that has really eroded in a major way. And so the way the conversation is happening is different. But then on the flip side as well, one of the other positives, one of the positives, sorry, the other one's not a positive, but one of the positives has been that now, in recent years, there is a much greater tolerance for the actual conversation, and more people from surprising sectors are actually expressing even out loud their reservations about abortion and how extreme things have got. So there's sort of pros and cons to that, but there has absolutely been a radical change. And I think of another area like, for example, euthanasia, where when I started in this work, you had like Michael Laws, who was with New Zealand First Party previously. He'd had an attempt, and then there was another attempt as well from the New Zealand First Party to legalise. They hadn't really got even close to the support necessary. And so it was this sort of what you might call a political fascination amongst a sort of minority section, if you like. And it was talked about in society, but it had not been legalised. Well, that's all radically changed now. Obviously, it's legal. It's practiced in New Zealand. It has big implications. So, absolutely, there have been some radical changes during that time. And I think, again, if I go back to that question of anthropology, one of the big shifts has really been, I think, the loss of our grounding in that authentic Christian anthropology. And so as that is lost, so your sense of perhaps where the boundaries of ethics and law should really lie, I think liberalism has become more dominant. The autonomous, self-choosing individual and the role of government is to really maximize your freedom basically has become a more dominant idea.
So if that phrase, Christian anthropology, there'll be some, including I suspect many practicing Christians, who are a bit unfamiliar with what that might mean. Let's flesh that out a little bit. What do you mean by Christian anthropology, and what would be perhaps a supremacy of the view of the human person?
Well, Christian anthropology basically is, what is it to be human, effectively? What does it mean to be human? And Christian anthropology, when you boil it down to its purest essence, is really this fundamental truth that every human person is the imago Dei, the image of God. And that is a radical shift. Like, once you understand that and you really believe that, that's why the West is the way that it is, and that's why it thinks about ethics the way that it does. Yes, we draw on Greek sources. Yes, we draw on, for example, in medicine, the Hippocratic tradition, which predates Christianity. Yes, we draw from sources out of Jerusalem. But it is really Christianity that elevates and brings those things to their fullness, and you see those practices and we take them for granted. A very clear example of this, probably, where something has been normalized and we just take it for granted now, regardless of whether you're a believer or not, is the absolute moral rejection and the legal rejection, and our abhorrence at the thought of something like infanticide. We're horrified by that today. That was not the instinct prior to Christianity at all. In fact, for certain periods of pagan history, even in the most enlightened cultures, infanticide was quite widespread in practice at times. And so that we take that for granted. We just think it's perhaps a natural inclination, but in actual fact, it wasn't. And a big part of that too is that Christianity, there are scholars who argue that Christianity, in fact, gives us the concept of childhood. as an actual thing, and the idea that children should perhaps be seen and protected in a special way. And those ideas all stem from this fundamental truth that if persons are the Imago Dei, then we have obligations to them. They are something truly sacred. To be a person is to be sacred in a meaningful way. And therefore, we have obligations. You don't disregard sacred things. You don't tread on sacred things. You treat them with regard and with respect and with profound love. And so you see how that would play out in law. You see how that would shape morality. You see why, effectively, from the advent of Christianity, it was only really a matter of time before the deeply ingrained cultural practice of slavery was going to come to an end as it became more and more apparent, our understanding of what it really meant to respect the dignity of other persons. And so it's that Christian anthropology is just absolutely essential. And as I said, it's grounded in that fundamental truth that every person is the Imago Dei. They are made in the image of God. And when you realize that everything changes, whether it's medical ethics, sexual ethics, law, all of it, economics. It's quite a radical shift in your thinking about how we conduct ourselves in the world.
Is there something paradoxical happening in modern culture, both within New Zealand and beyond? If we, as you say, we look at the Imago Dei, we look at the ministry of Christ and how that, expanded what we might regard as the precursor for rights. It elevated the position of women, it elevated the position of the foreigner, the one of a different religion, it elevated the position of children. And so the direction of travel was one of an extension of rights and regard. And we see that perhaps, now people are saying, well, perhaps we should be thinking about the consciousness of animals differently, and it starts to play into things like export policies. We're not happy to export animals to particular countries if we're not comfortable with the way they'll treat them. And yet on some fronts, our regard for extending those rights to humans might be more contested in the areas of your ministry. Is that a weird sort of balance that you're seeing?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a paradox. And I think a big part of this, of course, so for Christianity and our anthropology, I think something that is also perhaps underappreciated a bit, even by Christians, is how important the incarnation is. So this idea that God becomes man, for those who are not familiar with the incarnation, Christ is God embodied in, human form. So, Christ who is fully divine and fully human. This has a profound implication on elevating the status of what it is to be human, that God would take on human form and then also take that form and ascend back to the right hand of the Father with it. There's really like a redemption of creation that has come full circle after the fall and all of that. And that has profound implications and how we think about human persons. What you also need, though, alongside something like, an understanding of the incarnation, the Imago Dei, is you also need sound metaphysics. You need a sound philosophy. And really in the Christian tradition, the further back you go, it becomes more and more apparent that what we do today is actually something we shouldn't be doing, really, is we tend to make a distinction between perhaps philosophy and theology, but really they should be a lot more intimately connected, if not at times seen as one in the same. And so you need sound metaphysics to go with it. Otherwise, you do get into a trap. And there are parameters to what it is to be a human person or to be a person. And it's philosophy that helps us to see from a natural law perspective, regardless of whether you have any religious faith or what tradition you might come from, even if it's not Christian, there are certain natural law truths that we can all come to understand and observe. And one of these is in the area of the boundaries of personhood. And so if you've got good metaphysics, you're able to rightly recognize, well, an animal's not a person. And so therefore an animal doesn't share the Imago Dei. And therefore there are the obligations, we would say, or how we treat animals. Animal welfare, I think, is an important thing. It really is. But the obligation is different in the way that it plays out in the world. The obligation is on us as human persons, as opposed to the idea of, say, something like human rights, which is very much grounded in this idea that human persons are the imago Dei, effectively. They have dignity, and therefore, in and of themselves, a human can claim a right. An animal doesn't claim a right in that same way, but we have an obligation to be humane in our treatment, or humane is not really the right word, but to not be cruel in our treatment, or to unjustly destroy the natural world around us and things like that. So that would have a bearing on how we would treat animals. And so we would think about things like animal suffering in that. This often comes up, for example, in the debate about euthanasia, where you hear people saying, well, we euthanize dogs, we put them down, so, why wouldn't we do the same to a human who's suffering? Well, precisely because a human person is profoundly different. They have human dignity, an animal doesn't. We see their value primarily in the utility that they bring to us or to the world around us, and when that utility is lost and that costs too much, etc., we would rightly recognize that it actually is okay to euthanize them, but you don't do that to a human person, just like you don't feed your elderly mother from a bowl outside on the porch. There's a distinction that's going on here that really is quite profound. And then, so ironically, what we've got is in this period in history where we've got a confused metaphysics, and that philosophy is not well grounded, you start to see things like personhood being granted. I mean, I even think the concept of personhood being granted to corporations, which has been a legal construct, if you like, for a while. To me, there's big issues with that. The idea of personhood granted to mountains and to animals like whales, or there was a case some years ago in Spain, they were arguing gorillas should be given personhood. And these things were used as techniques to try and create protections, but they're also creating great metaphysical confusion in the culture as well. And it's not a good thing. And then while that's going on, there was a famous case in New Zealand, probably that local people will remember, where a whole entire species of snails had to be protected and moved so that a development could proceed that was going on around them, and great expense was poured into saving this species of snails. I got no problem with that. And as a Christian, I think to be good stewards of creation is sort of a fundamental part of the way in which we are called to relate to the world around us. But the point is, while that's going on, we currently have a law that does not recognize or does not give any meaningful regard to an unborn human being for all 9 months of a pregnancy. And that is a grave inconsistency. There really is a glaring problem there, a glaring inconsistency. And again, I think it comes down to both metaphysics, anthropology, and a loss of an authentic, vision of the sacred, a Christian vision of reality, which gives us a sense about how we should use power, and that power is something that should be something we regard with a sense of, to whom much is given, much is expected, as opposed to, well, if the powerful want to exercise that power to achieve what they want to achieve, then that's okay if the majority agree with them. So, my body, my choice, for example. If those who are more powerful than the vulnerable and the majority agree with this, they do not want to have to go through pregnancy, then, why shouldn't they be able to use that power in a way that ends up dominating the vulnerable, in this case, the unborn? And so you can see how, I know that's a very convoluted way of answering you, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that, you need that authentic anthropology. There is also a metaphysics that really is, you can see, is confused or missing at times for us. And again, I think a lot of this boils down to your view of the sacred. Do you have a sacred transcendent vision that holds your society together? What we tried to do with liberalism since the Enlightenment liberal period was basically, the idea would be that we would really coalesce as a society around a non-religious vision, and basically reason could sort of hold us together. We got away with that for so long because basically people were living religious lives in this quote-unquote liberal society. But once we lost our connection to that sacred transcendent vision of reality, that Christian tradition, and that eroded, and then liberalism actively at times started taking an axe to that tree of Christianity, not just ignoring it, but taking an axe to it, then all of a sudden what happens is, once that's fully eroded, or eroded enough, you now find yourself in a situation where it's becoming quite apparent that you can't hold a society together without a sacred transcendent religious idea that everyone coalesces around. That's precisely why you see in liberal Western nations, there is this collapse that has happened. And then you have other cultures that move into those regions, like, for example, groups of people from the Islamic tradition, and they still hold to their tradition, and they have strong, clear boundaries, and they do hold together. There's something strong about what they've got. And it's very clear that, that loss of a fundamental religious truth that unifies us has had a profound implication too on how ethics and other things play out in our culture now.
Mm. You're a father of 5, I
Mm.
believe. Has that the experience of care and concern for how to raise those children, has that had a big influence on your thoughts on culture and its orienting effects?
Oh, look, absolutely. There's no denying that. And I think this is one of the realities of an authentic practice of morality. You can talk about the moral law, you can talk about ethics, but there has to be an ethos that your ethic is grounded in. I mean, this is very much what Christ is doing in the Sermon on the Mount. It's what he does in the Gospel of Matthew when he talks about, you have heard that it is said, thou shalt not kill, but I tell you. And then he goes on to say, if you've held anger in your heart against another person, you've committed murder already. So what's happening here is, first of all, these antitheses that Christ gives, you have heard that it is said, but I tell you. This is understood by scholars as basically Christ effectively claiming the mantle of the new Moses. And so Moses is the old lawgiver, Christ is the new lawgiver, and his law is the law of love. And you can see this profoundly. And it gets harder, but B, what Christ is doing is calling us to an ethos, not simply an ethic that you follow. It's pretty easy to follow the rule, don't murder anyone. Most people could go through their life today without doing that. But to hold the ethos in your heart that underpins that, and again, it's grounded in this idea that human persons are the imago Dei, because of course, why would I find myself enraged at the imago Dei, like the image of God? It's quite profound, that ethos. And what's happening here is that we're called to a profound self-giving love in this. And so what that means is, if you're going to live the moral life well, like, it has to be lived. It's not just a set of propositions. It is relational in nature as well. I remember hearing some years ago, actually, someone referred to an anecdote about Peter Singer, the famous utilitarian philosopher. And Peter Singer, very pro-animal rights, big environmentalist, and he wrote some very infamous papers and articles in his time that garnered a lot of attention and certainly controversial, arguing all sorts of things. And one of them he talked about was this idea that basically euthanasia should effectively happen for people once they start to lose. He has an idea of personhood that effectively you are like materials. Human, materials, matter, and then we add certain qualities on top of that, and you've got personhood. And if you don't have those qualities in the right amount, then you aren't really a person. So for Peter Singer, you could have a fully developed ape would be more valuable, should be treated with more rights and respect than, say, a disabled person, for example, because they haven't fully developed. So it's this very utilitarian philosophy. And one of the things that he argued was that basically, if someone, for example, with dementia starts to lose their faculties, there comes a point at which you would euthanize that person and use those resources that have been, quote unquote, wasted on them for younger, fitter, healthier people. And then his own mother developed dementia. And what does he do? He's from Australia. He regularly travels back to Australia to be with her until she passes on naturally. And people pointed out, apparently, the inconsistency here. Someone who's big on environmentalism, someone who says that people who have dementia are not fully persons, etc. And why would you get on a plane, admit all this carbon, and go back and forth to do this? And apparently, what I've heard anyway, anecdotally, was that the response that he gave was something along the lines of, "Well, it's different when it's your own mother." And I think there's a profound truth in that. The reality is that I think to live well as moral people, there is this profound idea. You see it really in a big way first, this natural law truth and the ethics of Aristotle, that there needs to be authentic friendship. And it's in authentic friendship, I think, in that whole idea of friendship of virtue, of self-giving love, that really morality comes alive, and you understand the fullness of what's actually going on in that Christian vision of reality. It's not just a new set of moral laws. It's the fullness of what, as Christ says, I've come to fulfill the law. It's the fullness of what the law is supposed to be. It is the law of love. As St. Paul famously says, that you can have faith that moves mountains, but if you have no love, you are nothing. And so that is the fundamental reality of what it is to live out that morality well. And it's got to be grounded in relationships. And so when you have a child and you look upon, first of all, that's radically transformative, I think, for how you think about even things like human sexuality, because you realize you're holding the fruit of your love, your physical love in your arms, and you're naming it. It really, that whole dimension just comes alive for you. And then as you care and nurture for your children, one thing I've heard consistently time and time again from people is, I have become more conservative since having children. And what that means is I think they've started to have a moral awakening because they've had a profound encounter with the Imago Dei and in the first and most important of all communities, the family. And they've had that encounter with the Imago Dei. And the type of encounter you have as a parent is radical. And so it really does, I think, begin to awaken people and shift them beyond just thinking about themselves. Sometimes people talk about marriage and family life as the greatest school of love. And again, that's harkening back to that Christian anthropology, that Christian moral order that we see in Christ, the law of love, self-giving love, and it's lived out in a very tangible way in the family. So it shifts people, begins to shift their thinking and how they think about themselves and morality and everything in the world.
You talk about relationality. What's the importance of communities moving beyond the family to more local communities outside of that? What's the importance there? I think there's growing, perhaps in New Zealand beyond, there's growing interest online, a resurgence of interest in Christianity. But some commentators have suggested that the translation from the online and the abstract into the performative and the participatory aspects of the faith as a step, shall we say, still in progress. What's the importance of that, do you think? Even if we acquiesce to these ideas of a Christian anthropology in the abstract, what's the role of community in practice?
Well, community is absolutely essential, and it really, again, should flow out of this anthropology. The human person is made in the image of God in the Christian anthropology, and God is not a solitary being. God is triune, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, engaged in an eternal act of self-giving love that is fruitful. And so you realize all of a sudden, if we're made in the image of God and God is a community of three divine persons engaged in a perpetual act of self-giving love that is fruitful, you realize, well, we're made for self-giving love. We're meant to be fruitful in lots of different ways. And we are made for community. It's not just a nice thing to have or an added benefit. It's really essential to our flourishing. And the more you look at the human person, the more you realize just how true that is. This has been one of the great conceits, if you like, and one of the great delusions we've fallen into. It's the stupor, if you like, might be a better way of describing it, under liberalism. Because liberalism says, well, you're an autonomous, self-choosing individual, and you reason your own way to truth. And if you want to choose a community, that's great, or you want to choose a particular religious tradition, that's great. But no prior tradition, no prior community can really lay claim to you. You're an individual, and out of your freedom, you're supposed to make the choice in which direction you go. And what that has lulled us into thinking is that we are basically autonomous, self-choosing individuals, and we've structured our societies that way, our laws, our governance. This is precisely why you see increasingly these laws that will treat children, and sometimes even very young children who are fundamentally part of a prior community, the family and its prior tradition. Those laws will treat them now as if they are autonomous, self-choosing individuals, even though clearly they're not. That's the liberal idea and its practical outworking. And so as a result of that, we've actually lost sight of the truth that, yes, we are individuals, so we're not part of some collective, like, say, communism, which is a form of collectivism. We don't, and it's not like the Borg from Star Trek where you don't exist outside of it or something like that. You are an individual, but you are communal in nature. And this is the bit that I think we've essentially lost sight of. You don't bring yourself into existence. The first and most important of all human communities, the family. And the reason why it is the first and most important is because all other community and society flows out of the family. The family comes first. It has to. Without a first family, you don't have a society. So the first and most important of all communities actually gives rise to you. And then even traditionally within Christianity, for almost all of Christian history, and this is certainly true today of a lot more of the traditional denominations, the understanding is that the passing on the faith was initially done by your parents as well, that your parents actually got you baptized. So this tradition is given to you. It's bestowed upon you as well there. So, you don't, you're part of a community. You cannot survive without community. In your early life, you're an infant. You can't clothe, feed, hydrate, shelter, or care for yourself. So you need the community to keep you alive. If you are perhaps older or you experience a serious injury or illness, you need the community to sustain and help you to survive. And then also every single human person needs at least one other person to know as authentic friend, because that's the only way we really truly fully flourish into our own humanity, is by giving ourselves away and receiving another as gift. We really fully discover what the fullness of humanity can be. And so community and our communal nature is absolutely essential. And so we've lost sight of that. And as a result, as I think particularly as technology and other things have developed, like economic advantage and other things have really flourished for us, and as technology has developed, there has been an increasing tendency towards atomization, towards pulling ourselves away. Perhaps initially it starts with families being sort of reduced down to the nuclear family only. That's not really what a family is when you stop and think about it. And it's certainly for most of human history, we have not seen or understood the family as just mum, dad, and their kids. We've understood it as the extended family as part of it as well. And even those who have gone before you were part of, really very much held in your family in that way. And so perhaps that's where it starts. We sort of shrink it down to the nuclear family, and then we start, everyone gets a house and we get a white picket fence and we sort of pull away a bit. And there's still a semblance of community even in that, but then it sort of starts to erode further and further. And you can see how as technology begins its creep and other things, we have the ability to really atomize ourselves in lots of different ways. And it has been and is an absolute disaster for the human person and human society. The breakdown of community, it is. I mean, it's one of the great tragedies and one of the great evils, really, I think, of our age that has done a lot of harm and continues to, as you see technology increasing and the potential now, particularly with something like AI and where the trajectory in which that seems to be heading. You could potentially have someone you could imagine in working in situations, or maybe if they're not even working at all, who knows? But they're in situations whereby they might never have or have very minimal human contact now throughout their day. You can go into a supermarket, you can pluck what you want off the shelves and walk to a machine and pay for it, never even have to greet the cashier. You can now, they've got fully automated McDonald's in certain parts of the world that they're hoping to become that's apparently the model we're moving towards. You could see how that atomization is just, the creep of it is really starting to take hold for people.
If we focus for a moment just on a particular segment of the community, the wider community, I entered the church in Easter 2025, and I believe over the last few years in New Zealand and mirrored in Australia, there's been an exponential increase in the number of people entering the Catholic Church. Now, in my cohort, we were from all walks of life, and I don't know New Zealand specific details on gender, but I believe internationally there's a particularly strong surge of younger males into the church, and I believe it's also occurring into Eastern Orthodoxy. Do you have a feeling for what might be going on with young men in particular?
Yeah, I do. I have a real heart for young men, and it has been part of my ministry actually over the years too. Increasingly what I've found and seen is even within Christianity, it's not unusual to encounter men, even men in my age demographic, I'm 50 now, but men in my demographic who really didn't know authentic fatherhood in their life. And so, they need someone to help them on that sort of journey. I was very blessed in that. My father was a simple guy, had his own personal struggles, but he was a very good father, and I took that for granted for so long in my life, what he'd actually given me just by being a good father and present in my life in those key ways. And so I've always had a heart for young men, and I think what we are seeing now is increasing numbers of young men who they're really the culture around them is collapsing, and they're looking for something tangible that they can actually. This is really why tradition, I think, matters so much. Is with tradition, it is a rock that you can plant your feet on. And in a time of what Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist, called liquid modernity, where everything is constantly shifting and changing, tradition is essential. And I think one of the few places where really it is quite countercultural now to see that tradition. And I think also it is very much in the think about Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, it's grounded in often silence as well. And I think that's another very stark countercultural marker. And for young men, it's constant sort of busyness and it's constant noise. And also it's just liquid modernity and everything seems to be eroding. And so they're looking for somewhere to really plant their feet. And I think something that also appeals to that authentic masculinity that exists within every man. And there is something tangible about those traditional expressions of the faith which really do call you to spiritual combat. And I think this is one of the great beauties of the church is that, human beings, well, men really are, they're made for war, really. And if you don't give men a spiritual battle to fight and help them to recognize that it's not about powers and principalities, it's not about flesh and blood, but about powers and principalities, and that fight begins within them first of all, then they will go looking for other kinds of warfare that are not good in the world around them in all sorts of varying degrees. And so I think what you're seeing is a lot of young men who recognize that those other forms of warfare, if you like, the post-Fight Club generation, for those who know Fight Club, who might have read the novel or seen the film, and that's that whole idea really that that previously men could numb themselves to the lack of meaning in the world around them, really with a good job and commercialization and consumerism. You could buy stuff and you could mask it all. Well, that avenue of hedonism is largely broken down now to a lot of younger men because economically things are not so good. And so they realize that the promise was an illusion and it's collapsed. And so they're looking, I think, for something tangible and they're looking for meaningful combat that and something that's worth fighting for, worth dying for, and that also gives them the tools to do that. It's not simply, I think when you go to the traditional Christian denominations, it's not simply a faith of the mind, if I can say that. There's real, like the sacramental life and the sacramental economy, you go and you do things that are flesh and blood. You don't need to question, did I go into a confessional and confess my sins to another person? You don't need to question it because you did it or you didn't. It's very clear. When you receive Christ in the Eucharist at Holy Communion, did I actually receive something tangible? You sure did, and you consumed it bodily. Now, there's a question of faith and am I receiving really, is this Christ I'm receiving or just a bit of bread? That kind of challenge can still be there, but you absolutely did something. It's very tactile, it's real, and it's connected to a tradition that goes back 2,000 years. And I think those things really matter. And I think for young men in particular, there's just so much in there that is so countercultural. The danger, of course, the flip side is that there are those who would perhaps take advantage of that and want to try and lead men into areas of so-called expressions of faith which are actually not good, and that perhaps have a more an unhealthy and at times even an evil stridency about them that lose perspective of that profound Christian law of love and perhaps fall into the Nietzschean, Friedrich Nietzsche's tendency of Christianity as a type of power and a way to get your power. And that's really not what at all we should be focused on, of course. But I think I know that's perhaps it's very amorphous and a bit all around the edges, but I really feel that there's something, tangible that speaks to the heart of men. And it's, to be fair, it's not just men. I think, like I look at my own daughters and my teenage daughters of their own volition when we go to Mass together, for many years now, they've been putting on a veil at Mass. I mean, my wife doesn't do that. We think it's great, it's beautiful, but they did that of their own volition, and their peer group is doing that kind of thing because they think, hey, this is sacred. I want to show great reverence. It's really quite profound what's happening amongst that generation, not just men, but young people in general.
Yeah. Do you think there's something to? I believe in the past, perhaps still, you were a keen boxer.
Yeah.
Do you think, is there something to drawing on that experience of just the physical hardships, not necessarily the combat, but just the physical trials of boxing? And I'm wondering about some of these, the more older apostolic traditions of Christianity, such as Catholicism and Orthodoxy. Is there something to that physicality that you were just alluding to? The fasting practices, particularly of the Eastern Church, can be quite strenuous during Lent, etc. Is there something about that stridency that you think is tapping into something as well?
Oh, for sure. And you can see this, I think. I don't know if you're familiar with the phenomenon that was making waves, and it even got into the mainstream media a couple of years ago, and there was great certain sectors of society were aghast at what was being called raw dogging, which is like young men, for example, who would go on an international flight and they would not even watch a film. They wouldn't have a meal. They would just sit there and go through and endure it, raw dogging this thing. And this became a sort of thing. And it's aestheticism. It's really it's a secular attempt at aestheticism. And so you can see what's going on here. The human person is made for this kind of stuff. We really are. It's a fundamental part of God's plan, I think. The sacramental economy, I've really come to appreciate it because I spent it was really almost 10 years outside of the Catholic Church in an evangelical church. And I'm grateful for many of the experiences I had there. I still have great friends from that period. But I was very anti-Catholic during that period, and I really took for granted and attacked even and did not understand how profound some of those gifts were that God gives to the world through the sacramental economy of the church and how fundamentally important they are. The one moment I actually started to shift in my thinking, ironically, I was at a major evangelical conference that was being held up in Auckland, and they had different guest speakers. And I went along to one of the electives, and it was from a lady who's highly regarded, and her specialty was psychology. And she made this comment talking about a big focus was helping Christians to deal with guilt and shame. And she made this comment that her Catholic clients have less issues with hanging on to guilt, and she attributed that to the sacrament of confession. She said they go into a room and a priest actually tells them that their sins are forgiven, go and sin no more. And in that moment, I realized, maybe I have taken this for granted. It was the first sort of a little awakening I had. And I've really, from that point, really come to understand just how important some of that stuff absolutely is. And I think if you want to use the boxing parallel, I mean, I was never a professional or anything like that. For me, it was always just a sport that I participated on the peripheries to help keep me fit. I never claimed to be anything great. It was sort of a family tradition more than anything else. But I enjoyed the cut and the thrust of the combat and the muscle memory of you don't just walk into a ring and start swinging your fist. There's a technique to it, and it's so much of it's about muscle memory. You practice and practice and practice so that when you get into a ring and there's a big haymaker coming swinging at you, you sort of instinctively do something. If you have to stop and think in that moment, you're in trouble. You're going to be knocked out. And so there's something as a great comparison to the spiritual life, I think, and to the life of virtue as well. You don't just walk into the arena of combat, like you don't just walk into a boardroom where they're about to make some very serious and moral decision as a company, and then you suddenly stand up and you're a pro boxer of virtue or morality. You have to have a muscle memory so that when you find yourself in that situation, instinct takes over and instinctively you know what to do. And so virtue is like that. Your moral life, your spiritual life, and I've really, it's only in recent years that I've really fully come to grasp just how important that is. So for me, for example, my morning routine involves me getting up, and the first thing I do is a sustained period of prayer, and then some reading along a spiritual theme of some kind, and then I go to the gym. And what I've realized is that, that just as you think about training your body, training yourself spiritually and in virtue is another area as well, where this is essential, and you realize how it starts to build muscle memory. It starts to actually give you the tools that you need, and you like a boxer who walks into a ring, you're ready for combat, basically. And so I think the sacramental economy and the sacraments and those spiritual practices, they ground us in a very, I would say, incarnational kind of way. There's something profound about Christ's incarnation and how that, I think, connects us with the material world in a very new way, and the profound act of redemption, everything on the cross, and how that changes everything for us radically. And so these spiritual practices, I think they take on a whole new dimension. I know it can be very easy, like I did for a long time, to look at them from the outside and say, oh, that's just hollow religious, babbling or whatever. But in actual fact, if it's done with love and with a genuine desire to draw closer to God, these practices are profoundly important. I'll give you a tangible example. I've got a bit of a focus at the moment on the issue of Acedia. And this for me personally has developed because I've been through a period the last couple of years where initially I was grappling, well, for a long time I was grappling with what I would call imposter syndrome, I thought was like imposter syndrome. And then it became, there was a sense of burnout as well. What I've come to realize reading now more deeply, and I'm focused very much on this at the moment, on Acedia, is that in actual fact, the Desert Fathers had identified this problem almost 2,000 years ago. And it's not really burnout, it's acedia. It's a loss of that sense of, as David talks about in Psalm 51, restore to me the joy of my salvation. It's a loss of a sense of purpose of calling. And they went through it in the Desert Fathers in these desert huts in this life of asceticism. They realized this is why acedia is sometimes called the noonday devil. And the hottest part of the day is through the noon, and often the monks would get themselves into trouble and they would start to lose touch with their calling, and it had all these things that a sadness, a desire, and thinking, oh, I should run away and do another thing instead because I'll be happy if I do that. I'll leave this ministry and I'll go and get a regular career and then I'll be happy, and all these kinds of things. And we often see as markers of burnout, but it actually is acedia. And so you realize, my gosh, these aesthetic people of the desert from the early days of our Christian tradition and their asceticism, A, they understood it, and B, they actually had solutions that were tangible and real and were grounded in something real and practical. It wasn't just a thing of the mind. Oh, no, just have more happiness or joy as a Christian, you'll be happy. Yeah, you've got to actually foster that through certain practices. How do you do that?
So acedia, it's a loss of joy, is it? Or is it a loss of connection with purpose?
Yeah. So acedia, basically, today we wrongly wouldn't think of acedia, and we tend to think of the sin of acedia as being sloth. But in actual fact, that can be one of the manifestations of acedia, is you just become disinterested in what you're doing. You lose a sense of purpose and even the day-to-day stuff. In actual fact, it's not that. It's that's part of it. But acedia really is that loss of the sense of Christian purpose, or even purpose in general. And that comes from a disconnection, a loss of that original sense of Christian joy that you had in your, in your calling. I think, in fact, the more I've looked at this, I think back on the period when I first came into ministry, and I had such a strident sense of calling and purpose. And then if you fall into acedia, and the fascinating thing too about acedia is the early fathers talk about the fact that it's something that you don't realize you've fallen into, but once you recognize it, gosh, it's like, whoa, I've seen it. I recognize now the problem, and all of a sudden you get that clarity out of recognizing what's going on. But yeah, it is that loss of a sense of connection. You start to wander, basically. The noonday devil comes in the hottest part of the day for the Desert Fathers. They start to lose their sense of actually they should be in their cell praying and doing these other things. And it's true. We start to wander. We start to think, this is the midlife crisis, I suspect, for a lot of men today, is acedia. They think, well, if I just I bury myself in other distractions, or I leave this career and go and find another one, or even Lord forbid, someone says I leave my family, I'll be happy. It's all an illusion, of course. It's not really. What's missing is gaudium, is joy, genuine joy, which is not the same thing as pleasure. It's not the same thing as happiness. And I think acedia is a profoundly misunderstood challenge of our age. And you can imagine what it must be like for people who have no spiritual life whatsoever or no connection. You can see why. I think it's interesting. You see more of a conversation happening around things like burnout now and mental health crises in men and stuff. And I can't help but suspect that if we perhaps, like psychology, certainly modern psychology has a place, but I think that it's interesting if you go back before that, you see in the life of the Desert Fathers and others, the aesthetics and the mystics, you often see they're identifying these problems well before psychology is. And I think they're getting to the root of the matter, which is really about a spiritual malaise or a spiritual black hole that exists within the person, rather than just a psychological pathology of some kind.
That's fascinating. So my background is in medicine, and in part of the discussion within those circles around burnout, people have started talking more and more over recent years about one of the contributors, which was always just assumed, partly because of context, to be just sheer exhaustion. They said actually a more significant contributor is the notion of moral injury.
Mm.
The notion that you're spending all this time doing something that somewhere along the way you lost belief in it. That,
Yeah.
things, perhaps the way the medical system is working, perhaps the way it's churning people throughout the other side doesn't line up with your original purpose. And it sounds very reminiscent of what you're talking about with Acedia.
Oh, look, very much so. In fact, funnily enough, you're the second person in less than 48 hours. Just yesterday, I was having a coffee with someone, and we were talking about moral injury, funnily enough. And yeah, it is becoming more of a recognized thing. I think what you're seeing here is basically psychology grasping at, in a very, at times, sometimes it gets close. Other times it's just that the grasping is pretty clumsy, but it's grasping at these spiritual realities and these realities of the human person in our anthropology, which, if you go back to that sacred sense of tradition, they had a grasp on already, and they understood quite deeply and profoundly. And you look at the way they describe something like acedia, and then the cures and all the rest of it they prescribe. You realize, yeah, gosh, they really did get it. And a lot of this sounds a lot like what we would today, call, oh, that's someone. We'd say, oh, that person's in a state of depression, or they're in a state of whatever it might be, and they're recognizing these deeper things. And I think there's something profound in that, like the whole idea of, um, I think particularly in medicine, you think about the disconnect now often, how a lot of that has, and you can probably speak to this more than I can, but it seems to me there is a real corporatization of medicine that's gone on, and that is so contrary to the notion of why you would become a doctor. It's about caring, right? It's not about spreadsheets and bottom lines. The demand is increasing upon time. The way in which doctors are now often effectively dispensaries and prescription writers, and people are consumers. They're the client, not the patient. It's radically shifted. And all of that, I think, is tied up in a very profound and meaningful way, again, with a Christian anthropology and its sense of self-giving love and vocation, and how that should be outworked in the world. And that would include the practice of medicine. How do you practice medicine? And I think the way you practice it as a Christian is very different to the way you practice it if it's just purely a professional interest for you to make money. And there's profound implications in all of this. I mean, even if you look at the history of medicine, the way Christianity has radically shaped that for the better. And it goes back to not just that, oh, Christians happen to be nice people, but they have an idea, a sacred sense of who God is, who they are, and what their obligations to other persons are as a result.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the word client. That's something I've just always had a deep objection to in medicine. And I think because it speaks to the heart of what you've just been talking about, there's an implied shift of anthropology, which has profound implications. Mm. It's presented simply like it's this minor shift toward a sort of consumerist understanding of medicine, but I think the implications are wide-reaching and deep.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head there, because what's the relationship between a doctor and a patient, I think, is very different between the relationship, or even the concept of what a doctor is when you start saying doctor and a client. What is a doctor in that scenario? They are a dispensary of some kind, effectively. They are a utilitarian exchange involving some form of consumerism. And really, the client also is put very much in the power position, I think, in that. It's it's amazing how something that simple, I've said this for a long time, language is world building. It really is. And something as simple as a shift in language really does build a whole new world. And I mean, you're obviously living through that. And then you see, for example, on the back end of that, attacks on the rights of freedom of conscience for medical practitioners. They become a lot easier if you view yourself as a client who's come to receive a service or a thing, and you're not getting that thing, then a contract is not being fulfilled. Therefore, hey, doctors, we can take away your right to freedom of conscience so that you become better fulfillers of this contract, sort of thing. That's an exchange of money and goods and services, and not much more.
You've talked in the past about the role, or perhaps the failure of, the church's voice in the public sphere. How do you view that today?
I think it's interesting. The church probably, when it comes to engagement in the public square, I know some people can be overly harsh and say, oh, the church almost like the church didn't want to engage. So we withdrew because we didn't want to. I think it's a little bit more complicated. So I think a couple of things are happening through that period of disengagement. Number one is, I think, comfort just in general, comfort levels rise, and no one really wants to be uncomfortable, so you don't want to rock the boat too much. I think also there was a bit of a mistaken understanding about how the liberal scheme would all play out. Like, basically, I think a lot of people, even within the church, thought, well, liberalism meant that we'd just have our little patch and we would be faithful to that and they'd let us be, and we could carry on evangelizing and doing our thing. But now what's happened is increasingly liberalism has its own lack of liberalism basically built into it, its own illiberal tendencies, and they became more and more focused on the church and dominating the church. And then I think also what started to grow was a fear within, and I know when I say the church, I include myself in this, because if you're part of the church, all of us, it can be very easy to say, when we say the church, we think, oh, yes, the leaders, but it's all of us. It's on all of us. As I think a fear developed, and we there was, for whatever reason, we developed a timidity about our own faith, our own gospel. And I think someone who really exposed that, interestingly enough, was someone outside of the church, and that was Jordan Peterson, I think. Jordan Peterson just blew onto the public spotlight, regardless of where he's at now or how people might feel about him. He blew onto the public spotlight, and he started proclaiming hard truths about difficult things, and with just very bold clarity. And in fact, one of his big messages was basically, if you want to live a fulfilled life, it's not through self-help therapy. It's really through a life of virtue and self-giving and self-denial. It's very much embedded into everything he said. And he wrote a book about this, and it becomes a bestseller. And all of a sudden, I think what became apparent, well, certainly to me anyway, was that, hey, hold on, the Christian anthropology has a lot to offer here, and we've become far too timid. We just backed off. And we thought maybe we couldn't offer it, or we were scared to offer it, or maybe because of something like the sexual abuse crisis within the church, we thought we weren't entitled to offer that anymore. And it was a disaster all around. I think it also, you've got to appreciate too the post-World War II situation, where a lot of men in particular, obviously, but others as well, women who are involved too in war, they come home from the war, or the war comes to an end. And a lot of them, and there was a good instinct in this, they just didn't want to fight anymore. And that's not a bad instinct to have. You don't want another war. But the problem was, I think liberalism gained too much, or a particular brand of liberalism gained a foothold, where everything just became, well, we'll agree to disagree. And a lot of indifference, I think, crept in. And we did start to trade away too much of that that instinct, which was healthy and good, that, there is truth, there is goodness, and we do need to have charitable discourse that even is robust about that. And so I think all of that sort of crept into the church. And then you also have certain theological errors, if you like, that start to crop up at times. I mean, the reality is the church is always under attack. It's always been under attack from the beginning. As the body of Christ, the bride of Christ, what do you think the devil and all of his demonic entities are going to do? They're going to try and bring down the church, right? And so I think you have these moments where too much of the 60s cultural revolution did find their way into aspects of the church, and even within, sadly, the hierarchy of the church. And that had a bearing on how we listened too much to the culture, I think, rather than perhaps dialoguing with it. I think the dialogue is starting to return now slowly, but we weren't so much dialoguing as we were just listening and sort of taking on board, absorbing too much like sponges, when we should have been perhaps pushing back a bit more. So I know that sounds really complicated, but I think that's a way in which all of this is playing into the fact that we were not as strong a voice in the public square as we should have been for various reasons. And I think also we possibly didn't really equip. I'm thinking here particularly of the Catholic tradition, but we didn't probably equip our people in the West to be as effective evangelists and missionary disciples as they could be. What's now happening is there is more of a shift that's certainly happened in recent years, and there is a really strong, it's a beautiful emphasis on how do we actually recover that authentic sense of missionary discipleship. But that was missing for a while, and I think as a result, our voice was sort of silent where it should have been more vocal.
In preparing for this, I was watching through some of your previous work, and one video, I think someone asked you for some book recommendations. And one of them that you recommended that I've read and loved too was the Benedict option by Rod Dreher. And for those watching and listening who aren't familiar with that book, he lays out how a good portion of the learning of Christendom was preserved in Irish monasteries through something of a period of, you might say, retreat, drawing up the drawbridge perhaps. If we look now at the current cultural context of New Zealand and the wider West, what's the balance between some form of Benedict option versus stronger, strident cultural engagement?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I've when I think about the Benedict option, that was one of the criticisms that I consistently heard, whether it's in commentary or written commentary or people talking about it. Often two people who hadn't actually read the work was another interesting factor. But the most common criticism I heard was, oh, that's all good and well. It's all about retreat, retreat, retreat. But funnily enough for me, when I read it, I never really saw it as a clarion call to sort of withdraw. I saw it as a clarion call to actually build stronger intentional communities that would be like a bulwark, rather than a retreat. It was something that would actually strengthen our ability to save culture, if you like, and to be missionaries. And so, yeah, that was always interesting and fascinating to me. And I think his follow-up work, Live Not by Lies, I think was also profoundly important as well, and what it added to that. I think, where are we at now? Well, ironically, I think the need for a strong intentional communal bulwark Christianity has been really forced upon us by the collapse of the liberal order. I was reading a piece just the other day, actually, by someone who just says, look, the reality is we are all post-liberal now. We're living in a post-liberal order. Now, the post-liberal order is not an order in and of itself. It just means we are living in post-liberalism. And we're sort of not sure what's coming next or what's coming down the pipe. But liberalism really has sort of run its shelf life. And so there's all these implications for that. So I was speaking to a group earlier this week, actually, about the issue of euthanasia. Think about that. You can't, it's not like the church has the power to turn off this disastrous piece of legislation. But what we do have to do, I think, is we need to form intentional communities that will actually come up with solutions to protect our vulnerable elderly from the risk of euthanasia, that will actually perhaps even figure out, well, how do we help people who perhaps can't afford healthcare as that becomes more and more of a looming issue, staving off the crisis of loneliness. And that's just one example of many you could probably cite where effectively I think that intentional communal Christianity, it's just essential now. It's like it's not an option so much as a necessity. And B, it will become the fundamental sort of city on a hill for the wider culture. They'll look to it and they will say, man, they're getting it right. I mean, they're not perfect, but man, I like the way they live. I see within that something real. And I think this is part of why you are seeing people being drawn to more sacred, sacramental expressions of the faith, because that sacred nature of it is really upheld and it's reverenced. When you walk into a sacred Catholic liturgy or a sacred Eastern Orthodox liturgy, for example, it doesn't look like a Christian imitation of what you see in the culture around you. It's very different. And so, and there's something about that sacred and the sacred silence that really it's life-giving. And so I think what will happen is it will become like the salt and light, the city on the hill. People will see that and they'll recognize those who perhaps knew authentic community prior and have seen it break down will go, where is it to be found now? Oh, it's found over there with those religious believers. Or people who have never known community because maybe they were born in an age of widespread atomization, they will look to it and they'll go, man, there's something really radically different about that. And once they experience it, it just, because they're made for it, the human person really comes alive and they're drawn to it. So for me, it's not really so much of, is this a strategy or not? I feel like it's the only obvious way forward for us is it's just got to be. I don't know how. I mean, I even think about economics and things like that. How do young couples now afford houses? and if you have intentional communities of religious believers who are thinking about how they utilize their money, even generationally, and perhaps setting up schemes that enable younger couples to get into homes and things, you realize how all of a sudden, yeah, how important and essential this is. The birth rate's another one, the massive fertility decline that we've got and the crisis we're in there. Well, what do you need? You need community to nurture people, to give them a witness of hope, to actually having babies and having family as a doable thing. You need older, wiser mothers to act as a communal support for young mums who are on their first time journey. You need mums together in community, together who are doing it together. They don't just think, oh, I'm in the workforce and I've got community there, but if I leave the workforce and have a baby, no one will be with me. So I think it just in so many ways, it really is. And what was the beauty of that book was that it was a call, I think, a hearkening back to a genuine and deep and embodied Christianity, not just a Christianity of the mind where it was like, well, I believe something as an individual and I go to church on Sunday as almost like a consumer and I get something out of it and it's all really how I feel about it and my experience. No, that genuine embodied incarnational Christianity is always about the community. It's outward, it's other focused. And I really think that was one of the great geniuses of the Benedict options. It's really pointing us back to what a truly embodied Christianity, certainly in yesteryear, would have looked like. And perhaps at times we wrongfully disdained it. I remember being in the room and hearing people, we're talking, 30 years ago, 30 odd years ago, I hearing people give presentations where they would talk about, certain denominations like Catholicism, they had a Catholic ghetto or an Anglican ghetto, and that they had Catholic dances and Catholic social clubs and schools, and it was all like they were living in a ghetto, as if it was bad, as if in a very derogatory way. I realize now that wasn't really so much a ghetto, that was a community that was genuinely living a communal life together, and we've actually lost that. And we need to recover that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I received the Benedict option in the same way, by the sound of it, that you did. I thought these Irish monasteries that he talks about, these were places of generation. They were the precursors of publishing houses. They were, not only preserving the ancient wisdoms, but they were, making copies and proliferating them. And I heard the same thing. I heard it as a call to build Christian institutions, to build places that would generate the world as we would hope it to be.
Yeah. And that's how it was built, right? Christendom, and that's been one of the great stupas we've fallen into too, is that this idea that basically perhaps the Renaissance, or more, most people probably, they think the Enlightenment liberal period, Bacon comes along, destroys all of our superstitions and builds the world, the better version of it. In actual fact, it's really the other way around. And in fact, those thinkers are originally drawing on that tradition that came before them, and that world is built profoundly by Christianity. But what you get with Bacon is something like the myth of progress, which starts to unravel that actually, as we start to think, well, we will save ourselves with our technology. With progress, we'll force our way back into Eden. We don't need God to get back in there. And it's that failure to recognize just how fundamentally important that sort of stuff is. And I think even within Christianity, we perhaps lost sight of just how important those institutions actually are. I mean, I know for me, when I was younger, I used to think of and speak perhaps of the institutional church in a very derogatory kind of way. But in actual fact, institutions, they can become ossified and they can lose their way if they don't remain focused on Christ. But that doesn't mean that an institution in and of itself is not a good thing, and it's not something that God would desire to have in the world to use.
Well said. Brendan, this has been a real pleasure. For those who'd like to learn more about you, where can they go?
Well, probably the best place to follow me, and I say this to groups now all over the place, is check out my Substack and podcast called The Dispatches. And I have podcast episodes. I have writing there as well. And you probably track me down on social media as well, but if you want to do that. But otherwise, I think The Dispatches is generally a pretty good place if you're interested in engaging with what I have to say. And as I always remind people, all glory goes to God for anything good that comes out of this mouth. There's plenty of rubbish, so all glory to God for anything good. And anybody who perhaps might have enjoyed what I've had to say here today, again, glory to God for that.
Amen.